Hello, it's Dr. Karen Becker, and today we're going to talk about urine pH and bladder health. For you to understand your pet's urine pH, it's really important that you understand the pH scale. So 7 is neutral, everything above 7 is alkaline, everything below 7 is acidic. Cats and dogs, being carnivores, are designed to have a slightly acidic urine pH. In fact, optimally, their pH should be between 6 and 6.5. Dogs and cats, being carnivores, are designed to consume meat, and when meat's consumed, it drops the pH into a healthy, slightly acidic range. Vegetarian animals like goats and horses have a very alkaline urine because they eat primarily grains and grasses, which facilitate a very alkaline or high urinary pH. That's designed perfectly for them. But here's the interesting problem. When dogs and cats, which were designed to consume meat, are fed a grain-based diet, it causes their urine pH to become alkaline. And 3 major problems come about when dogs and cats develop alkaline urine. Number 1, the natural bladder defenses are unable to maintain the urine at that 6 to 6.5 perfect ratio, and you can end up with potential infection. When the urine is sterile at 6 to 6.5, it's very hard for bacteria to grow in that environment. But when the urine pH becomes more alkaline, it's quite a bit easier for animals to develop potential urinary tract infections. So when the pH starts creeping up to 7, 7.5, 8, the bladder loses its natural ability to prevent infection. And of course, opportunistic urinary pathogens or infections can occur. The second thing that can happen is a condition called cystitis, which means inflammation of the bladder. Now, kitties are very prone to feline lower urinary tract disease, and sometimes it's called feline urologic syndrome, FUS. But when cats have a very alkaline urine pH, they can end up with chronic inflammation of the bladder. And although chronic inflammation of the bladder doesn't always translate into infection, absolutely chronic inflammation, number 1, is very painful. Number 2, can cause the lining of the bladder to become inflamed and then in turn bleed, and that sometimes is what prompts a trip to the veterinarian. But most importantly, it causes a lot of pain and inflammation for the kitty, so they can end up with a chronic state of inflammation that can actually predispose the kitty to potential infection. The third and most common scenario with a chronically elevated urinary pH is urinary crystals, or sometimes stones. When a urine pH becomes alkaline, then minerals are allowed to settle out of the urine, and minerals can form together to create crystals. Crystals are exactly what you could imagine. They're microscopic, very sharp particles that roll around in the lining of the bladder that create trauma, irritation, and inflammation. The most common type of crystals for dogs and cats are called magnesium ammonium phosphate, or MAP crystals. We also call them struvite crystals. And struvite crystals can occur primarily because the urinary pH is too high. On occasion, rarely, there's a bacteria, several different classifications of bacteria that can cause infections to occur. They're called protease splitting bacteria, but for the vast majority of cases, crystals end up settling out of the urine because the urine pH is simply too high. So when the urine pH begins to elevate, crystals can form, and if crystals are left in the bladder long enough, those crystals can cohese together to create stones, or bladder uroliths is what they're called in veterinary medicine. So it's important to recognize that maintaining a healthy urinary pH is really important, not only to avoid potential infection, but also inflammation, crystals, and stones. If your pet's urinating outside the litter box, or if your dog's drinking more or urinating around the house, it's important that you drop a urine sample off at your local veterinarian. Your veterinarian can determine lots from the urinalysis. We can determine if there's white blood cells present, which means there's inflammation or potential infection. We can do urine culture and sensitivity, which means we can submit some urine to the lab and determine what bacteria is present, if at all, and most importantly, what medications are needed to effectively treat that infection. But sometimes dogs and cats simply have an inflammatory process or crystals without the presence of infection. It's important to know that infection is treated with one set of medications, and that inflammation and crystals are treated with another set of medications. So most importantly, it's important to realize that, above all, your dog and cat can have elevated urinary pH secondary to an underlying dietary problem, which is the vast majority of cases. If your pet is dealing with chronic inflammation or chronic urinary tract infections, it's time for you to evaluate diet. of course, the most commonly referred to dietary change that veterinarians are going to offer you is a prescription diet. Prescription diets are traditional diets that contain oftentimes high carbohydrates, which of course can foster an elevated urinary pH, but we add in medications that drop the urinary pH back down into a healthy range. In my opinion, it's not that I'm anti-prescription diets, but it makes a whole lot more common sense for you to feed a food that doesn't contain those alkalizing carbohydrates. And by feeding your pet a food that naturally is low in carbohydrates, you can oftentimes acquire a perfect optimal urinary pH without having to use prescription diets.